All right, Chodesh Tov, everyone. Hello to you. Greeting you through the screen. I hope you're all doing well in your isolation, and I hope that your Pesach cleaning is going well. I hope that it hasn't driven you crazy yet. And it's kind of weird to think that in about 2 weeks from now, we're going to be celebrating Pesach, but it's going to be a very different Pesach than the past, It's the first time since our shul's inauguration, since we've come into existence, that we won't be able to have a Pesach service and won't be able to gather here for Pesach. But thou shalt not fear, right? No need to fear, because if you think about it, that's exactly the same way it was done at the very first Pesach in history, the one in Egypt. God told them, stay home that night, and anyone who goes out of the house, what happens to them? Plague number 10, death of the firstborn. So back then already, God sent out a tweet saying, hashtag stay home, right? Flatten the curve. So it's nothing new. We can do this, you can do this, we'll make it through. And if you are still stressed, if you are still a bit fearful about the whole epidemic, it's probably because you haven't repented enough. Think about it, right? We're disciples of Yeshua, we're followers of Yeshua. We fear nothing. Death has got no hold over us, no diseases, nothing is supposed to scare us, because we are living not for this era of the world, but we are living for the world to come. So you shouldn't be scared. If you are scared, maybe you should start repenting a little bit more. Okay, so today is our third gathering, if I'm not mistaken. Well, let's call it a gathering, right, for Rosh Chodesh, for the ladies' club that we've started. And we are going to talk a little bit about the month of Nisan. It's a wonderful month. In fact, it's the big one, right? Nisan is the head of all the months. It was about this very month that God spoke when He gave the commandment to sanctify each month and set up the calendar. God said this will be the beginning of the month for you, the month of Nisan. So it's a big one. Furthermore, it is the birth month of three of the most famous people in the Bible. Our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were all born in this month, the month of Nisan. So it's a big one, right? Now, last month was, of course, the month of Adar. We had fun with our Purim party. And we had fun learning about Psalm 22 last month and how that was the Psalm for Purim. But the month of Adar, remember, had a famous saying about it. What was the saying? When Adar enters, joy increases. Now we're going into the month of Nisan, and Nisan itself also has a famous saying. Anyone know what the famous saying is for Nisan? It's that when Nisan enters, it's a time of miracles. Nisan is a time of miracles, because the name itself, what's the Hebrew word for a miracle? It's a nes. Yeah, Nes Gadol is a great miracle. So the word Nes itself is in the name of this month, Nisan. And of course, the greatest miracles in history for our nation, the Jewish nation, happened in the month of Nisan when we came out of Egypt. And that wasn't just 1, 2, 3, let's go. There were some big miracles that Hashem performed for us, able to allow us to leave Egypt in that month. So since your activity for this month, for the ladies, has been painting Pesach pillows, I thought today, we could chat about that. And I'm hoping that those of you that have already started painting your pillows, I hope that it came out nicely, that you guys were able to follow all the instructions and get a nice pillow for your Pesach Seder this year. So today I want to talk a bit about painting. But before that, I want to show you how Rebecca's pillow came out. She had a bit of help from Judah, so hers is customized. So I hope you can see this well on the camera. There's Becca's pillow. Judah's little name is down there and his handprints, because he can't keep his hands off nothing. It's a nightmare trying to survive this coronavirus and the spread of washing hands when you've got infants in the house. But we will make it. Alright, so this month I want to talk about painting. Interestingly, in connection with the month of Nisan. But before I get into that and discuss painting, I have a little joke for you. A joke concerning painting. Hopefully you guys know a little bit about famous artists. So the joke goes about the thieves that were caught trying to steal a famous collection of paintings. They were trying to steal a Van Gogh, they were trying to steal a Degas, they were trying to steal a Monet, all from the famous Louvre. Right? But they got caught by the police because they were good art lovers, but they weren't such good thieves. So eventually the police caught them after a high-speed chase through the highways of France, where out of nowhere, their van just died in the middle of the highway. So eventually when the police caught them, an interviewer ran up to one of the thieves and asked the thieves, well, what is it that went wrong in your master plan that you couldn't get away with the paintings? And the thief explained, as poor thieves, we didn't have the money to buy the gas to make the Van Gogh. Right, so there's our artist joke for the week, right? So let me ask you a question. Can anyone think of a connection between the idea of painting and the month of Nisan? Is there a connection? Is there any time in the past where the nation of Israel, the whole nation, had to paint during the month of Nisan? I'm trying to listen through the screen to hear if you guys got the answer. Yes, there is, right? The very first Pesach in history, the one where we were in Egypt, we were instructed to paint the doorposts and lintel with the blood of the Pesach lamb. So that's the connection that I want to talk about today. I thought about when we're going to speak about the month of Nisan, and you guys are doing the activity of painting. I thought, well, let's get into this. Let's talk a little bit about the painting of the blood on the doorpost. And of course, they used not a paintbrush, but they used a branch of hyssop to go and paint that doorpost. So they got artistic back in Nisan 3,000 years ago, and you're getting artistic in the month of Nisan 3,000 years later. You're doing it for the sake of making a nice comfortable pillow for your Pesach Seder. They were doing it for the sake of not dying. So there's a different level of degree of comfort between the two of you. So today I want to explore what we can learn from this painting in the Pesach story. So first of all, let me ask you this question. Did we paint our doorposts every Pesach after the Exodus? You should know the answer. No. It was a once-off commandment. It was only that year when we did the Pesach sacrifice in Egypt that we had to paint our door with the blood of that lamb. It never happened again in history. Even when the temple stood and we still did the Pesach sacrifices, we never painted our doorposts again. Right? Similarly, they also only needed to take the lamb into the house on the 10th of Nisan once in history. It was a once-off thing. Only in Egypt did you have to take the lamb into your house on the 10th of Nisan. It never applied again in the future, right? So there's a few of these things that only happened once off. But I want to follow this up with another question and ask you guys, was that Pesach lamb that we had there in Egypt, was it a sacrifice to God, or was it a festive meal? Can you differentiate between the two? Was it a sacrifice unto God, or was it a festive meal that God wanted us to partake of? We're entering the book of Leviticus this week. We're starting a whole new book. We said Chazak, Chazak last week. May you guys be strengthened while you're sitting there at home. And we're going to learn about the different categories, the 5 different categories of sacrifices in the book of Leviticus. But those laws and those sacrifices were only given after Mount Sinai. I'm talking about what happened in Egypt before Mount Sinai even. That Pesach lamb, was it a sacrifice or was it a regular family meal? Now the thing is that our sages noticed the language used in that Pesach lamb, and they realized that a lot of that language that's used sounds resoundingly like language used when talking about the sacrifices in the Torah. For example, here's 3 points just to help prove that point. This is all from Exodus chapter 12, which talks about that section where you're supposed to take the Pesach lamb. It says, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a yearling male." Okay, so first of all, these are clearly sacrificial rites. The fact that it has to be a year old, and the fact that it has to be unblemished. Right? If it was just for a regular meal, how many of you go to a restaurant, look on the menu and say, "Oh, I'll have the year-old lamb chops," right? And decide, "Oh, while you're at it, make sure it's unblemished." These seem to be things that are only required specifically for sacrifices. Okay? But it's talking about this before we even had a tabernacle. Let's look at another example. Exodus 12:10, it says, "You shall not leave any of it over until morning. If any of it is left until morning, you shall burn it." Okay? This is also a law that's specific to the sacrifices. I mean, with normal food, you can keep normal food to the next day. What do you do after you leave a restaurant? You ask for a doggy bag. You can keep the food for a week. They say in a Jewish home, every single meal of the week is leftovers. The original meal still hasn't been found, but they're still living off leftovers, right? So you do this. Plus, with the sacrifices, it says here, if it's left over till morning, you have to completely burn it. That only applies to something that was used as sacrificial meat because it was given to God. And a third example I can use is the expression where it says, this is in Exodus 12 verse 9, "It shall be roasted with its head on its entrails and its legs." Right? Now, the statement over there only appears one other time throughout the Bible, throughout the Chumash, and that is In Leviticus, where we talk about the sin offering, it appears as well that this shall be done specifically with the sin offering, the Chata'as offering. Now, interestingly, just as a side note, the Talmud actually discusses how on Pesach you would do this. How would you put the head with the feet together? And they explain that you would actually take the lamb and you would take its hooves and you would put its hooves on top of its head like this. And in English, it's called a helmeted kid. But a better translation is that the goat would have a crown upon it. The lamb, the Pesach lamb, would actually be wearing a crown, which is a lot of messianic significance for us who know that Yeshua himself wore a crown of thorns at his crucifixion on Pesach, or the day before Pesach. Anyway, so let's get back to our discussion, because it raises a bit of confusion now. Was that original Pesach lamb a sacrifice, or offering, or was it just a meal? Well, here's the thing about offerings. The reason why it's called an offering is because you're actually offering some of it to God. That's one of the main points of bringing a sacrifice or an offering to God, is you want to give him something to find favor in his sight. And what do? Is you give him something of value. That's why usually in the offerings and the sacrifices, we give him the best portions of the animal, because we're saying to God, we want to give this to you because we're so thankful for what you're doing to us. But when it comes to this Pesach lamb in Egypt, did we give any of it to God? It doesn't look like it, right? It looks like we took it all for ourselves. Not much was offered. Something must have been offered. So, by the way, where do you offer something to God? Specifically on an altar. They didn't even have an altar in their homes at that stage to give something to God, right? If you look in the past, you'll find Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even Moses, they actually built altars before they performed offerings unto God. What about the families there in Egypt? They didn't have an altar to perform the offering, right? So let's talk a little about this. I came across a commentary in the Talmud that actually explains this for us and makes it clear. This is from Rabbi Yosef. This is from Tractate Pesachim 96a. He says, in Egypt, there were 3 altars. Anyone want to guess what the 3 altars were in Egypt? Well, what's the purpose of an altar? What is the practicality behind having an altar? It's so that you actually have a place to go and put the meat on and to put the stuff on and to sprinkle the blood upon it so you can give it to the deity. So what are these 3 altars that he was speaking about? He goes on to explain. It is the lintel and the 2 doorposts upon which they painted the blood. That was the altar of the people while they were still in Egypt. Right, so there was something that we could offer to God from the lamb. He wanted us to eat the whole lamb, right, and burn up the rest if there was anything left over. But he said to us to take the blood and paint it on the doorposts and the lintel. That represented our altar. We could give something to God. Because remember, blood is the most important part of the offering of the sacrifice. Because it's where the life lives. And the reason why we bring these sacrifices to God is because we want to come close to God. But of course, there's a problem. We are not pure, we are not sinless, we are not able to enter the realm of God as fleshly human beings in our sinful state. So when we approach God, we need a covering of sorts, and specifically a covering of blood, right? That word for covering and atonement is kapar, so that we can have atonement to be able to approach God. So that's what's going on in this story, right? It was important to have this blood on your doorpost, of course, because otherwise, that night, all the firstborns would die. So the Pesach in Egypt, if you look at it now, it's starting to look a bit more like a temple service, right? It's a offering. It's an offering. It's like the temple service in its bare bones format, right? We have an offering, we have the sprinkling of blood, we have a shared meal, we have specific instructions that makes the offering kosher, etc., etc., etc. And there's a few of the tabernacle laws that seem to appear in that Pesach meal in Egypt that I want to have a look at. So here's one example. There's actually a few. Let me see how many. I think I've got 4 examples here. 4 examples of how we see the laws of the tabernacle and the temple already being in some way shown in this Pesach meal that they had in Egypt. So firstly, the meat of the lamb was not allowed to leave your house. You had to eat it in the house. You can't take it outside and feed it to somebody else. It has to be eaten in the house. Similarly, in the tabernacle, we see the laws of the tabernacle. The meat that made its way onto the altar was not allowed to leave the tabernacle at all. It was holy and had to be eaten inside the tabernacle. Couldn't go outside the tabernacle, just like our meat in Egypt couldn't go outside the house. Secondly, the Israelites were instructed not to have any leaven, any chametz in their home that night when they were eating that meal. Just like it is in the tabernacle, right? In the tabernacle, no chametz was allowed at all upon the altar. It wasn't allowed to touch the altar. That's part of this week's parasha, right? In Parashat Vayikra. So you see the connection here, how the Israelite home functions as the altar functions in the tabernacle. Here's a third example. The Israelites were instructed to eat the Pesach lamb with unleavened bread, with matzah, right? That's why today in our Pesach Seders we have this tradition where we eat this thing called the Hillel sandwich. We take matzah, and then we take the maror, and then we take another piece of matzah. In the temple times, they would put meat with it and make a proper sandwich, the Hillel sandwich. And they would eat that because the commandment is, you shall eat the Passover with matzah. So they make a sandwich, right? So in the temple offerings, we see the same thing happening, right? For example, the Thanksgiving offering, which is what a Pesach sacrifice is anyway, always had to be accompanied by matzah. Always. It's a law. And here's a fourth example. The Israelites in Egypt were specifically told to roast the lamb over fire. You couldn't do anything else with it. You couldn't bake it in the oven. It had to be specifically roasted over fire. In the temple, it's the same. All the meat that was brought for sacrifices in the temple were roasted over fire. Which fire specifically? The one on top of the altar. The temple did have some ovens, but that was used for baking the bread. It was never used for the meat. All the meat had to be roasted over fire. So what we're seeing here in this comparison between the altar and the tabernacle and the Jewish home in the story of the Exodus from Egypt while we were still in Egypt is that our Jewish homes were functioning as the altar of God. And that's a very important message. And I think it's a major theme of this entire month, the month of Nisan, and specifically the festival of Pesach, which is the big deal in this month. It's what this whole month circles around. Now, you know, the whole Pesach Seder, the way that it's designed and all those steps that we do, it's pretty much designed for you to be in your home with your family. Right? There are commandments that make that you're supposed to make your children inquisitive by asking them questions and doing funny things at the Seder table. You're supposed to clean your house immaculately. I hope it's going well for you. And you're supposed to stay up late that night. All these things that we do are geared towards giving us house arrest. Right? It's the original social distancing tool before Cyril even got on the stage and told us to stay home. Right? We aren't supposed to be having these massive gatherings for our Pesach Seders and boast about how many people we had at our Pesach Seder this year. It's meant to be at home with you and your family. But what about those that are single? Even if you're single, even if you don't have family, you can still do the Pesach Seder home alone, right? Without watching the movie. You can still do it home alone, right? There's many people that do this. In fact, there's a Rebbe Sin who is famous for going around the world teaching how to keep a Pesach Seder alone at home because her husband passed away many years ago and her children have moved out the house and they're Chabadniks, so her children have moved all over the world. None of them live in the same county as she does. So every year she has to keep Pesach Seder alone if she's not invited by their children overseas. And she does this, and she does this for many women. So you can do the Pesach Seder alone as well. Okay, but the point that I'm trying to bring across is that our homes can function as the altar of God. And I think that's a very, very important concept for us to understand. And you should be really glad to hear this, especially now that we are stuck at home, that we're in quarantine. The lockdown is coming. Now, there's an argument amongst our sages that I want to discuss. They asked the question, where on the doorpost did the Israelites have to paint the blood in Egypt? And what do I mean by where? Well, some argue that the painting of the blood would be on the outside of the doorpost, outside your house. Because, the Torah says, so that I will see it and pass over you. But there are other sages that argue and say, no. The painting of the doorpost occurred inside the house. Because the verse says, you shall paint this blood on your doorpost and your lintel, so that it may be a sign for you, and I will see it and pass over you. So it's a very interesting discussion between the two. Because the ones that are arguing to say that the painting was inside are saying, how can we say that God needs a sign to know which house is Jewish? It's God. He's all-knowing. He doesn't need a sign. He knows who's who in the zoo. That's why the verse specifically says it'll be a sign for you, not for God. The sign is for us. And therefore, the painting was done on the inside. Because the inside of your house represents the altar of God. You know, there's an interesting thing that we do every year at our Seders, right? And it also has to do with painting the door and the lintel. Can you remember the 15 steps of the Seder? How many of you can list them off by heart? I hope you should know it by now. You should be preparing for Pesach, right? Step 1 is Chodesh, Urechatz, Karpas, Yachatz. So step number 3 is Karpas. What is Karpas? It's a weird word, by the way. So in Karpas, that's usually the step where we dip the parsley into the salt water, right? And many times we say this is because it represents the bitter tears that we had from the slavery. In South Africa, we don't really do the parsley. We do potato. We dip potato into salt water. That's what you usually find at our seders in South Africa. But this is not how it was always done. I want to take you back in history. You know, the reason why we have the potato nowadays is because South African Jewry is Ashkenazi, and Ashkenazim come from Eastern Europe up there, and it was pretty difficult to find fresh greens when it came to April time living out there in the cold. So instead they just used whatever they could find as staple food, and they used potatoes, right? But originally it was parsley. But even the salt water is not the original way of doing it. We never used to dip it in salt water. We used to dip it in vinegar, but more specifically, in red vinegar. It had to be red vinegar that we dipped it in, right? So why? Why do we have that step in the Passover Seder? There are 2 reasons that our sages gave us. It's supposed to remind us of 2 things. What is it reminding of us of? First of all, it reminds us of the start of our exile down to Egypt. And secondly, it reminds us of the start of our redemption from Egypt. It's like 2 opposite poles. It's supposed to remind us about slavery and freedom at the same time. So sometimes within a bitterness, there is a sweetness that you can taste, because when you see trouble coming, you know that God's going to help you get out of it eventually. So let's look at those 2. How so? How can they say that the dipping of the karpas reminds us of the start of our exile? Where did our exile begin? If you can remember back in the story of Genesis, where did our exile down to Egypt begin? Who was the first Jew that had to end up going down to Egypt out of the sons of Jacob? It was Joseph, the beloved little Joseph, remember? And what happened to him? How did he end up in Egypt? His brothers betrayed him. And what did they do? They took his coat off, threw him into a pit, took that coat and dipped it in the blood of an animal, and took that as fake news back to their father to go and prove to him that, oh, your son has died. So this is the first thing we're supposed to be reminded of when we dip our karpas into that salt water today. It used to be parsley into red vinegar to remind us of the start of our exile into Egypt. And by the way, the word karpas itself is not even a Hebrew word, right? It's not a Hebrew word, it's a Greek word. So it only appears one other time in the entire Bible, and it's used in the book of Esther. We just did Purim, right? Where it refers to the material of the curtains that were used in the palace of King Ahasuerus. So it's called the pasim. So it's very interesting that this refers to that coat of Joseph that was used and was dipped into the blood. By the way, just a bonus point. How many of you know how long Joseph was in the pit? 3 days. He was in the pit for 3 days, and afterwards he came out of the pit. Which sounds familiar, because the same happened to our master Yeshua, right? His brothers also betrayed him unto death, and he entered the pit of darkness of death for how long? 3 days, and then he came out. So it's something to think about when you're doing your Pesach Seder this year. Okay, so that's the first one. That's remembering the start of our exile. But we also have to remember the start of our redemption. How so? Where did our redemption begin when we were in Egypt? When we took the hyssop and dipped it in the blood of the lamb and painted our doorposts. What we're talking about today. That was the start of our redemption. Because the blood of that Pesach lamb allowed us to draw near to God and to sanctify our homes as the altar of God at that stage. And that's why this year, actually every year at the Pesach Seder, when I'm dipping that parsley or that potato into the salt water, I always think of the verse where Yeshua was on the cross and they offered him something to drink, right? It says that they took a sponge, put it on the end of a branch of hyssop, dipped it in the vinegar and gave it to Yeshua to drink. And he had a little taste, and what did he say? He said, "It is finished." It's exactly the same thing happening there at Yeshua's crucifixion as what happened in Pesach. So every Pesach we symbolically dip so-called hyssop into the so-called blood when we dip our potato or our parsley into the salt water. So karpas itself, that part of the Pesach Seder where we dip, has a double meaning, right? Just like the start of the exile happened through the betrayal of the brothers, so through the start of the exile, the last 2,000 years happened because of the betrayal of the brothers against Yeshua. But so too, hidden in that darkness is the light of the redemption, because so too, the start of redemption, which happened with the dipping of the hyssop into the blood of the Lamb, so too with Yeshua's crucifixion, it was the start of our redemption, the redemption of all mankind through the death and atoning sacrifice of our Master Yeshua. It's a very interesting concept. Okay, so I want to get back to the painting of the doorposts. I came across a very interesting commentary on how they painted the doorpost this week from the Zohar. It says that they didn't just go and dab 3 lines as fast as they could. They actually went and painted something on their doorposts. So I'm hoping, ladies, you are also very careful when you're doing the Pesach pillow this week. You're not just splashing everywhere and making a mess. Right? It's nice to paint it in. So what did they paint specifically on their doorposts? The Zohar goes and tells us they painted the 4-letter name of God on their doorpost. Okay, well, if you think about it, that was the whole purpose of the 10 plagues. God decided he was going to make his name known among mankind. That was the purpose of the 10 plagues. Remember, Pharaoh said to Moses, "Who is this Adonai? I've never heard of him." So then Moses went back to God and said, "Hey, Pharaoh's never heard of you." And God said, "Okay, now I will let him know who I am. I will show my name to him and let it be revealed among all mankind." And that's where the 10 plagues come from. It shows us who God is and the power of God. So as the Israelites sat inside their homes that night, doing their Pesach Seder, they would look at their own doorposts and they would see the name of God. And that is why the verse says, "You shall apply the blood on your doorposts and your lintels so that it will be a sign for you." What is a sign if you're able to see God's name and his protection? It's that when they saw the name of God on their doorpost, it strengthened their faith in him. And this is what granted them protection that night from death. The power of the name of God. So what we can learn from this, the painting of the doorpost and staying at home, is that our homes can become miniature temples. You know, we're talking about Rosh, Chodesh, Nisan. What is the most famous event in history that happened on the new moon of the month of Nisan? It is that very day that we dedicated the temple to God, the tabernacle. We finished completing the tabernacle and we dedicated it on that very day, Rosh, Chodesh, Nisan, to God. It's almost as if we cut the ribbon to the building and said to God, "Now you can enter your home." God came to dwell among us. You know, it's quite sad that we couldn't get together for this month's Rosh Chodesh meeting, right? It would have been very nice to get together and congregate in the shul, which is kind of like a home as well for our religious practice. And I just want to point out that Judy did a wonderful job in organizing these packets for all of you so you could paint at home. And you did a wonderful job with the video as well with the help of Calvin. If you could hear us through the camera, we're giving you a round of applause, right? But now that you guys can't be here, you know, we're going to sit here and you're all going to put up your eisels and all paint here and look all fancy, right? I could have even posed for a still painting if you guys wanted, but it's not going to happen. You guys have to do it at home this year. But the fact that you're doing it at home and the fact that we're probably not going to gather here in public for the foreseeable future has got to make you think about the idea that your home can also be a miniature sanctuary. Right? Ezekiel talks about this during the exile. The temple was destroyed, but God went with us into exile because he said, there I will be for you a little sanctuary, a mini sanctuary. So our homes have that potential to be the altar of God. What we do inside this home can be a service unto God, even if we can't get together at the shul. So let your houses in this month of Nisan be a place protected by the name of God and by the precious blood of Yeshua, our Messiah. I wish you all a Chodesh Tov. It's a month of miracles, so please God, we will witness miracles in this month. Anything can happen, right? We're going to shut down to lockdown, but we believe in miracles. We believe that God has got our back. So pretty soon, God willing, we'll be able to gather again for the next meeting for Rosh Chodesh over here. I wish you all a Chodesh Tov.